Hi, I'm Mary Collins, a 35-year-old therapist, and for years I felt trapped in the comfort of my routine. On the outside I had the appearance of confidence, long brunette hair, a curvy figure, but inside I was restless. My marriage to John had settled into something safe, predictable. We had been together for over a decade, and the passion that once existed between us had faded into something familiar. I loved John, but the thrill was gone, and I longed for it. One night everything changed. John had thrown a party for his colleagues, and that's when I met Richard. He was one of John's friends from work, someone I'd heard about but had never met in person. He was tall, muscular, with a confidence that was hard to ignore. The moment our eyes met from across the room, I felt something stir inside me. Richard had an intensity about him, a charisma that drew me in, and before I knew it we were deep in conversation. His charm was undeniable, and as the night went on, I found myself laughing and flirting in a way I hadn't in years. There was a lightness in our interaction, but underneath it all, there was something more, something electrifying. When we exchanged numbers at the end of the night, it felt innocent enough, but as I left the party, I could already feel the excitement bubbling up inside me. It started with harmless text messages, small talk, a few jokes. But before long, those messages turned into late-night phone calls. At first I told myself it was just friendship, but the more we talked, the more flirtatious the conversation became. His deep, smooth voice was intoxicating, especially in the quiet of the night. I remember one particular call, when he told me how much he had thought about me since the party, how he couldn't get the image of me in that dress out of his mind. I felt a rush of excitement at his words, my pulse quickening as we flirted back and forth, our conversations becoming more suggestive. It wasn't long before the phone calls took a more erotic turn. I remember lying in bed one night, my breath catching as Richard described, in detail, what he would do if I were there with him. His voice was low, teasing, and with each word my body reacted. My skin tingled, my heart raced. I found myself responding, my voice breathless as I let myself sink into the fantasy. That night was the first time I touched myself to the sound of his voice. I realized how deep into this I was already. It was thrilling, forbidden, and I craved more. After that, we didn't hold back. We would call each other late at night, sharing intimate moments over the phone, building up the sexual tension between us. Richard would tell me exactly what he wanted to do to me, how he would touch me, how he imagined me moaning his name. And I'd respond, telling him what I wanted from him, how much I wanted to feel his hands on me. It was an escape, an exhilarating, dangerous escape from the monotony of my everyday life. But the phone calls weren't enough. We needed more. We needed to feel each other in person again. So we arranged to meet, this time with no pretense of just talking. I remember the anticipation building as I prepared for our second rendezvous, slipping into a dress that made me feel sexy, confident, powerful. This time, the excitement was even more intense, knowing exactly what was going to happen. When I arrived at the hotel, the air between us was electric. As soon as the door closed behind us, Richard pulled me into a deep, passionate kiss. His hands were everywhere, running down my back, pulling me closer. I could feel the heat of his body against mine, and it was like all the tension we had built up over weeks of phone calls finally exploded between us. Our kisses were hungry, desperate, and I could feel the intensity growing with each touch. He led me to the bed, his hands sliding up the hem of my dress, and I shivered as his fingers brushed against my bare skin. Slowly, he knelt in front of me, his hands gently parting my legs as he kissed his way up my thighs. My breath hitched as his lips got closer, and when he finally reached the most sensitive part of me, I gasped, my fingers gripping the sheets. His mouth was warm, his tongue teasing and exploring, sending waves of pleasure through me. I could hardly breathe, my body trembling under his touch as he expertly brought me to the edge, then pushed me over it. The sensation was overwhelming, and as I came undone, I moaned his name, the pleasure coursing through me like fire. I had forgotten what it felt like to be so completely consumed by desire. Richard didn't stop, his mouth and hands working in sync until I was shaking, my legs weak beneath me. When he finally pulled away and looked up at me, there was a knowing smile on his lips, and I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He knew exactly what he had done to me. After that night, our affair became even more intense. We met several more times, each encounter more passionate than the last. We couldn't keep our hands off each other. Our desire was insatiable. We'd sneak around, finding moments where we could be alone, sometimes in hotels, sometimes in more risky places. Every time we met, it was a rush, the thrill of the forbidden, the danger of getting caught, all mixed with a raw, undeniable passion between us. And when we weren't together, we were on the phone regularly, something we both craved when we couldn't be physically together. Richard would call me at night, his voice low and seductive, and we would lose ourselves in the fantasy of being together, describing in explicit detail what we wanted to do to each other. I would lay in bed, my body responding to his words, touching myself as we spoke, imagining his hands, his lips, his body pressed against mine. It was intoxicating and I couldn't get enough of it. But the more time I spent with Richard, the more the guilt began to gnaw at me. I still loved John. He was my husband, the man I had built a life with. Yet, with Richard, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. I was caught between two worlds, the safe, familiar life I had with John, and the wild, passionate affair I was having with Richard. The contrast between them was stark, and it tore me apart. One day John confronted me. He had found a hotel receipt, and the look in his eyes made my stomach drop. I knew in that moment that everything was about to come crashing down. I tried to explain it away, but the guilt was too much. I broke down, the weight of my actions finally catching up to me. It became clear that I couldn't keep living this double life. Ending things with Richard was painful. When I told him, I could see the disappointment in his eyes, but he understood. What we had shared was intense, beautiful even, but it wasn't sustainable. We said our goodbyes, and as I walked away from that chapter of my life, I knew it was time to focus on my marriage. John and I went through therapy. It was hard, but we worked through the issues that had been building between us for years. Slowly, we began to rebuild the trust that had been broken. We found new ways to connect, new ways to explore each other. And though it wasn't the same as it had been in the beginning, it was deeper in some ways. We rediscovered a different kind of intimacy, one built on honesty, commitment, and the willingness to grow together. My affair with Richard was a whirlwind of passion and temptation, but it taught me something important. Real love isn't just about the rush of desire. It's about the strength to face challenges together. John and I grew from this experience, and we emerged stronger. But the twists and turns of desire, betrayal, and reconciliation are never easy. If you've ever felt torn between comfort and excitement, or if you've ever been tempted by the thrill of something forbidden, make sure to subscribe to the Confessions podcast. There's always more to uncover, and who knows what story will capture your heart next.